it's a really great opportunity just to see how did designers work. So when you can often talk to actors about their process, and they'll tell you in interviews about like how they create a character. But here with design, we can actually go through and see the very first sketches, let's say, that Boris Aronson does for Fiddler on the Roof. And then that turns into a paint rendering, and then it turns into technical drawings that are very precise kind of blueprints. And then you see photographs of the show. So you can watch the process develop from the, sometimes literally on the back of an envelope, all the way up to the fully realized set in a photograph, or in the case of more recent productions, on the videos that we have in the Theater on Film and Tape archive. All the archives that I've used in my research here myself, I find that our archive is one of the very most open. So really you can walk into our building off the street and be looking at Beethoven manuscripts, or Boris Aronson's designs, or Patricia Zipperot's costume designs. I would say from walking in the door to sitting down in front of the material in less than 15 minutes.
Hi everybody, Michael McElroy here, one of the founders of Black Theater United. Welcome to Before the Curtain Rises, the Designer Series. I hope you've been enjoying all of our conversations with the many different designers talking about their fields of expertise in the many different places that they can be in design in the industry. But we have a special episode today. I'm here with the curator of the Billy Rose Theater Division here at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, Mr. Doug Reside. Welcome.
Thank you.
We thought it was important that we have this conversation here at the New York City Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center to talk about research and how that really pertains to designers as they do their work. So we are really grateful to have Doug here with us today. Doug, tell us a little bit about what your role is here.
Yes, I take care of the theater collections here. There's 3 curators, theater, music, and dance, and so theater falls under my purview. I have a team of about 17 staff members that include librarians and curators and specialists in various fields. And so together we take care of the material. We try to make sure that everybody that wants to look at it has the opportunity to do so and can find it. And then we also do programs and exhibitions to help increase interest in the history of theater.
So all of our designers, we ask this question because it's always exciting, I think, for young people to know how someone arrived at the place they are. So where did you grow up?
Yes, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I lived there until 1997 when my parents moved to Alabama, and I went to college in Northeast Missouri at a public university called Truman State University up there.
Okay, and when did this interest in musical theater begin?
Well, so in St. Louis, there are several different theaters. One is the touring venue, the Fox Theater, where I saw one of the early tours of Les Mis and really loved it. But also there's the St. Louis Muni. It's actually a 10,000 seat outdoor theater that does about 6 to 7 musicals each year. And so during this, and they have free seats. About the first 2, or actually the last 4 rows or so are completely free. So it's first come, first serve. And so I saw a lot of kind of the musical theater repertory as I was growing up at the Muni.
Okay. And what was the first musical that you saw that you went, wow, that's...
Yeah, well, I loved Peter Pan. That was when I was a little kid. I really loved Les Mis when I saw that. That was when I was in 7th grade or so. I thought Man of La Mancha at the Muni was really fantastic. I saw Ken Page, who we just recently lost, but I saw him in Cats at the Muni, I believe, and in lots of other roles. He was a frequent performer at the Muni. Okay,
and so I know we've talked a little bit earlier, you went to college, but you double majored in English and computer science. I'm not seeing musical theater anymore. So why did you make those choices? did you ever think that you wanted to go into musical theater, or how did these two choices come about?
I actually ended up minoring in theater as well because I was really interested in theater, but more from the literary and script side. And I think growing up in the middle of the country, there wasn't really a lot of examples of what you could do with a theater degree necessarily. And so, but I did see how English teachers often also taught theater classes or directed plays. And so I thought initially that I wanted to teach English in high school and maybe direct plays while I was there. But I also really liked, these were in the 80s. I played a lot of the old computer games that were entirely text-based. So things like the Infocom game, Zork, that sort of thing, where if you are too young or to remember that, you would it would all be text and they would describe where you are and you would say what you wanted to do next, which felt sort of like performing in theater. You were inhabiting a character and performing that character to tell a story in collaboration, so to speak, with the writers of the game. And so I wanted to, I really liked writing my own games. And so I started taking computer classes to kind of learn how to do that better. And I just sort of, in some ways, ended up with a double major by accident. I got to the middle of my junior year and I realized if I took a little bit more science, I could actually do a full computer science major.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then did you go on after that? And what did you major in after that?
Yeah, so I thought I was going to be I thought I was going to work at Boeing in St. Louis, an aerospace company, well, as we all know, I guess. And the first day that I was there, they were walking me around and they were pointing at people that were wearing fuzzy foam hats with animals on them. And I asked the HR person who was walking me around, well, what are the foam hats about? And she said, well, we just had a consultant who came in and they are teaching us how to express our emotions. So be careful of the person wearing the crab hat because they're probably crabby today. And I thought at that moment I'm going to go to grad school. And so I did a master's and then a PhD in English, but I wrote about musical theater all the way through. First writing about how to study musical theater from a literary kind of approach. And then my PhD created an electronic edition of the musical Parade by Jason Robert Brown and Alfred Urey to try to look at the different ways to present texts that are so collaboratively edited and so fluid. They change a lot, as people in theater know, that every new production often has slight change. Every night actually may have changes in the text, slight changes, but ways in which the text is not very stable.
So it's really interesting because I'm slowly starting to see the worlds come together to create where you are now, right?
Yeah.
It's English, musical theater, science, because it's technology based and all of that. It's all starting to come together to bring you to this moment.
Yeah.
So how did you get here?
Yeah, so my first job out of the PhD was at the University of Maryland, where I worked in a digital humanities center, which is a place where you kind of work to create tools to help researchers interested in studying the humanities. And while I was there, I hosted one of the musical theater conferences, Song, Stage, and Screen, which is one of, if your viewers are interested in, it's a place where scholars from all over the world actually come together to talk in an academic way about musicals. And one of the directors here let me know that there was a position coming open, and so I applied for that job. I was initially the digital curator, and then I became the theater curator in 2014.
And so, as we're trying to connect this, as you know, I teach at the university, and one of the things that I'm always very passionate about with my students is research. So, as we're talking to some of these designers out there, or young people who might be interested in design. What does research have to do with that, specifically here?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that researchers really help designers. One is to look back at the ways, if you're doing a revival, let's say, so the revival of Gypsy or Love Life at Encores or, I don't know, One Spot on a Mattress. It's always interesting to see what choices the artists who worked with this text in the past made and how did they interpret the text. And so that might help you better understand, kind of, especially if you look back at the original production where all of the collaborators are, of course, working together to create the thing. What were some of the ideas that were behind the production that might not remain in the text itself, but were part of that production as you look at how the designers are working? So we have, maybe a little later, we'll look at a script of the costume designer for the Broadway version of the musical It's So Nice to Be Civilized by Mickey Grant. And so she's trying to think through what the text is, and they're kind of reshaping the text, and actually in a way that eventually Mickey Grant, the writer, really didn't like. And so, but this costume designer became a kind of co-author of at least the Broadway version of the text. And so we see that in the archive. The other thing that is really interesting is designers often look back at the era that they're trying to create. So our collection, actually the theater collection, came out of the picture collection at the library, which is still an active collection at the 42nd Street building, Schwartzman building, where researchers can come and look. It's sort of like an early Google image search. You can say, I want to see pictures of buildings or pictures of cats or whatever. And they bring you out folders that have things that have been clipped from magazines and encyclopedias and books about whatever the topic is. And so Boris Aronson, the scenic designer who worked with Sondheim and Hal Prince on Company and Follies, he designed the original production of Fiddler on the Roof. In his collection, which we have here, we actually have lots of photocopies from the picture collection where he went to look to see what did a hospital look like, and he wanted Company, he said, to look very much like a sterile hospital building. Or he actually wrote to an archive in Germany to ask for pictures of cabarets in Weimar, Germany, because he was the designer of the original 1966 production of Cabaret. And the archivist there wrote back a kind of short letter saying, "We'd love to help you, but we've recently been bombed, as you may know." And so, so there is that way that researchers, designers can come and look at what things looked like in the past to help create the new world that they want to make on stage.
Yeah, and so you have all these things in archive, all these pictures and models and all these different things, but there's also a technological part to it that you're passionate about. And in fact, you wrote a book, which I think Fixing the Musical, How Technology Shaped the Broadway Repertoire. So as we are evolving, just in terms of what we can do in terms of technology, how does that play into what we're going to see later that you have, but also how research is evolving?
Yeah, I think that theater, while it is certainly a very ephemeral and live art form, I think the musicals that we come to love, we often come to love as much from the physical traces that these productions leave behind as from what we saw on the stage. The stage may have started our interest, and we may in fact go back to see a show multiple times, as many fans do, but we engage with the musical more often through the movie version or through the cast recording or through even bootlegs that people might encounter on YouTube. There are ways that the musical is both a live art form, but also very much a mediated art form. And so that's what my book is about, but it's also what we do here. We preserve those more permanent objects that tell the story, that record what was seen for 1 or 2 hours on stage.
Mm-hmm. And so for a young designer, who's just starting out, or someone who's been in their career for a period of time, they are offered the opportunity to be the lighting designer or set designer or costume designer for a show. Mm-hmm. You recommend, as I think I do, that they come here and see the images, the designs of past productions, not just to see what that designer was doing in order to replicate it, but just to understand what the foundation was, right? But then also it's about learning about the history of that world as well, because that's also a window in when you see what they're designing.
That's right. And also I think it's a really great opportunity just to see how did designers work. Mm-hmm. So when you can often talk to actors about their process, and they'll tell you in interviews about like how they create a character. But here with design, we can actually go through and see the very first sketches, let's say, that Boris Aronson does for Fiddler on the Roof. And then that turns into a paint rendering, and then it turns into technical drawings that are very precise, kind of blueprints. And then you see photographs of the show. So you can watch the process develop from sometimes literally on the back of an envelope, all the way up to the fully realized set. In a photograph, or in the case of more recent productions, on the videos that we have in the Theater on Film and Tape archive.
Mm. So what would be the process for a young designer or any designer who maybe hasn't thought, oh, maybe I should go there? What's the process to come here and to have access to the archive?
Of all the archives that I've used in my research here myself, I find that our archive is one of the very most open. So really, you can walk into our building off the street and be looking at Beethoven manuscripts or Boris Aronson's designs or Patricia Zipperot's costume designs. I would say from walking in the door to sitting down in front of the material in less than 15 minutes. You need to sign up for a library card, which anyone can have. You don't have to live in New York or even in the country to get a library card. And then you have to sign up for a special collections account. And actually, if you want to, you can do that before you come here even. So you can get that set up before you arrive. But if you don't want to do that, we'll help you do that. And then we'll order the boxes from our basement. They'll come up and we'll take a look at them.
And are there people from your amazing team available for people to talk to?
Absolutely, yeah. If you write to theater with an R-E, so theater, Theatre, at NYPL.org, so for NYPL, New York Public Library, NYPL.org, theater@NYPL.org. And we will answer any question that we can. And if we can't answer it, we'll invite you to come in and look at the material as well. We also actually are able to take reference photos for you. So if you have a small amount of stuff that you want to look at and you are far from New York, we will actually take pictures of the material for you and send it to you. It won't be high quality, but it'll be maybe enough for your research purposes. We can't do that, unfortunately, as people I'm sure will ask with the Theater on Film and Tape collection. That's tightly restricted by our agreements with the unions and guilds that allow us to film these things for in the first place. But for the paper material, for the most part, we'd be able to send you a few reference images.
Just from my own curiosity, how do you end up choosing the shows that you end up archiving that you see?
Yeah, so there is one of the members of my staff, Patrick Hoffman, is the curator of that project, and so he goes out and sees a lot of shows, and then he and I talk with several other people on his team, and then we often, there are some theaters that we know that we always try to get. There's other cases where producers are able to help us raise the money to do the filming. So a lot of times it has to do with whether we have funding to do the recording, but often it's that the show we really feel like is something that people in the future will want to look back at that production. Mm-hmm. So it may not even be the best, like the most artistically innovative production, but it may be something that we just know that this is something that researchers will want to look at in the future. And of course, we also want to capture excellence. So we do try to capture the things that are artistically excellent as well.
And how many do you usually film in a season?
About 30.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's Broadway, off-Broadway?
Yeah, Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, mostly regional. Sometimes we're able to go out to other areas of the country, but for the most part, it's in the area.
So, last question. What do you want young designers or designers who are up and coming to know about, one, why is it important, the research? And what do you want them to come away going, okay, that's something that I want to make a part of my process?
Yeah, I think that the opportunity that you have in New York to come and look at the way that the work has been done in the past is kind of amazing. Like really in any career, if you can kind of learn from the very earliest attempts to the final product and see that product develop over time, and it's a really amazing opportunity, I think, for any designer to learn, to kind of essentially trace the hands of the masters. I also think that one thing I hope people realize is that this is a place that's really open to everyone. And so because we have to provide security for the materials, this is one-of-a-kind material, it can sometimes feel a little intimidating to go through the various security processes that you need to get here. But I hope people recognize that we welcome you and that we really want you to be here. And that this is you as designers and as researchers are the reason that we collect this stuff. It's not to sit on the shelves. It's not to for us to put up an exhibition every couple of years. But it's really for people just like your viewers. And we hope that they feel really welcome whenever they come here, and also that they feel encouraged to ask us questions if they have questions, if they don't know how to get at things. Like nobody really knows how to access the archives when they first get here. There's really famous artists who come in and are completely, I think, intimidated by just the process of we have so much and there's so many different systems. And so I really hope that people feel encouraged to ask us and not intimidated about the kind of, the challenge of getting at this material.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's just as I sit here, we're going to look at some of the pieces that you brought out, but it's not just a window into the production, it's a window into the world during that production, right? Because we're looking at the way in which designers had to create their work. Today, for example, with technology, we can do all this stuff on computer. Building what, like you talk about, these designs that they have to do to scale or whatever, and we can do that now in the privacy of our own home on our computer and do almost everything there. Whereas at this time, it was all done by hand and done, so it really is, it's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to not just see what the beginning experiences were around that, creating and developing the show, but also what tools they had at their disposal.
I think that's absolutely right too, that it's not, so we certainly have different technologies now, but it's not as if the designers that we preserve in the archive weren't using technologies. And so it's interesting to see the mimeograph paper, the the tracing paper, the blueprint reproduction technology that they had at the time. So that to kind of see what were the technologies at the different phases of the 20th century. Anyway, that's a kind of geeky interest of mine, but I think it is interesting too, as designers, just to see like, how did people solve these problems with what was available at the time, and how were they innovative, not just in the creative work of creating the design, but also in the kind of process work of making that work and sharing that work.
Yeah, that's exciting. You mean the blue paper that you could smell?
Yeah, that's right. The chemical. One? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I remember that.
Diazeprints. Yeah.
Now we get to my favorite part, which is to look at some of the things you have in your archive that we sort of talked about. But what's this one here?
Yeah, so that's the costume designer Ruth Morley's copy of Mickey Grant's script for So Nice to Be Civilized, which was a show that started at the Moss in the late 70s, early 80s, and then transferred to Broadway. But during the transfer, the show was changed significantly, and Mickey really hated the Broadway version of the show. So that script shows the script in transition, which is one of those things that we were talking about earlier, that it's really interesting to kind of see a work as it changes, not always for the better in this case, but yeah, you can kind of see like how a text develops.
Yeah, and it has, it's all typed. What we do on the computer today, the cut and paste, but all typed with just cut, crosses out. But like, those famous typewriters, and it's the full script that came through the costume designer, not through the writer herself.
That's right, yeah. So the Mickey Grant's papers are papers that I really hope someday will stay here, but right now they're still looking for a home for her work. But she's an amazing writer. If your viewers don't know her, she worked throughout the 70s. She had 3 or 4 shows that came to Broadway, but wrote many more with Urban Arts Corps, which was a company created by Vinette Carroll in the 70s, and her work is just amazing. Actually, Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, which was one of the shows that she was nominated for a Tony Award for, opened in our auditorium in 1970, about 2 years before it moved to Broadway. Oh, wow. So anyway, she's been part of this kind of library world for years and years.
That's fantastic. So here I recognize many of these faces, but tell us about these pictures that we're seeing here.
Yeah, so this is the original cast of Ain't Misbehavin'. They're photographs taken by the photographer Martha Swope. And I wanted to pull out a picture of Ken Page just in his memory, as again, one of the people that I remember from my time in St. Louis.
Because he's St. Louis.
He was, yeah, and he died in St. Louis. He was living there up in the last few years.
Yeah. And what I love about this, we have the photos from the actual performance, those, but we also have here, which is the what?
It's it's a photograph of the recording session for the cast album. So speaking of the artifacts that are left behind, this is the making of one of those artifacts that then kind of became the way that many of us encountered Ain't Misbehavin' for the first time.
Which is fascinating to me because I have that cast album, and so to connect what I've been hearing to actually seeing the people actually doing the thing is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you see these photographs or see a documentary like the company documentary. You imagine that recording happening on the stage, but in fact, this kind of shows us what was actually happening when the record was created.
No, that's fantastic. And then what do we have here?
So this is more Ain't Misbehavin'. This is the costume designer's costume Bible for the first national tour. So after the designer creates the design, this is Randy Barcelo, I think was his name. He was a Cuban designer, moved from Cuba in his childhood, actually, and then to the United States, became a designer of all sorts of things, including Broadway shows. And so when a designer finishes their design, they give to the team that kind of maintains the costumes all the sort of instructions for how to build the costume. Again, if it's, they need to repair it on tour. So there's fabric swatches that we can see here.
Wow.
And in this case, it kind of says what each of the different pieces of the costume should be. Sometimes measurements for the actor currently playing the role.
Wow, this is amazing. I don't want to mess up anything. Wow. That's amazing. Wow. I would like to ask you a few more questions about the book.
Sure,
you talk about, I just saw you used Sound of Music as your example, but just give us a little bit more about, what that connection is that people have and then what they expect to see when they see a show where their emotion, is it an emotional connection because of the technology?
Yeah, well, I think it becomes the text that they're familiar with. So I think you may have had the experience where you go see a show and you have learned the cast recording really well, and then somewhere along the line in the production history, there's been a lyric change, and you sort of stumble because your mind is kind of singing along with what people are singing on stage, and then there's maybe so you know that show really well, and maybe in the recording for whatever reason they made a cut or they made a change, or just over the course of the run they've decided that this lyric works better than another lyric, and so that sort of is you have a text that you expect, and then the text that you're presented with sort of trips you up. And I think that really happens when you are doing regional or amateur or even professional theater, when you realize that the text that is licensed is different than the text that you know. And so The Sound of Music is one of those examples, because The Sound of Music was one of the very first movies that was ever released on home video. I think it was one of the first 5 VHS tapes that were ever made. And so people came to know because it wasn't just on TV, which it was every year, but it was not just on TV, but also something that someone could take home very early on in the history of home video and watch and rewatch as you would listen to a bit of music. And so people expect, for instance, My Favorite Things to be in the bedroom scene during the storm, but the original text has it in the Abbey right before Maria leaves. So it's basically in the moment where the film has I Have Confidence. And so everyone that produces the show, or not everyone, but most people that produce the show, want to move it around. And so that's something that's generally is not allowed by the licensing agency, whether it's Rogers and Hammerstein or Concord now, that licenses the show. And so I think that that idea of the expected text versus the presented text is something that's sort of interesting, but that we also come to know and I guess think of the important shows because of the shows that we had access to. So I think that it's no accident that despite the fact that there were lots of really important and kind of arguably formally integrated in the same way as Oklahoma shows prior to 1943, but that Oklahoma was, because of some musician strikes, the only one from that period that was virtually fully recorded onto 78 discs at the time. So it was the first cast recording that had the first cast, that had the full original cast and the full original orchestra. And so you got basically the show as it was on stage. And so folks started to think of that as the first book musical, even though it's kind of indistinguishable from Lady in the Dark or Pal Joey or some of these shows that preceded it.
Yeah, it was just interesting what you were saying, because I was thinking about The Sound of Music, which is the example you use. And my introduction to it was seeing it on TV,
right.
A movie musical. So much so that when I got the album from the Broadway albums that were coming every month, I think it was Time Life, was it?
Yeah.
And I listened to it, I was like, this isn't The Sound of Music.
Yeah.
The voices were different.
Yeah.
The music was different. And so my connection really was based on the technology that was available coming into my home, which first was TV,
right,
as opposed to the record.
But it's interesting you chose, I assume you could choose which album you wanted from that record club, and that you still went for The Sound of Music, because that was the one that you knew from the film version. Yeah.
Well, are there any, you talked a little bit about exhibitions that you do here. Are there any coming up that we should know about?
Yeah, so there's a few. Right now, if you were to come in the fall of 2024, there's an exhibition by the dance division on the Joffrey Ballet. In the next one that the theater division is working on, we're collaborating with a professor at NYU, Michael Dinwiddie, who's curating a show on Black musical theater that I think is really going to be fascinating. And as Michael and I have talked, what we really hope the audience will realize as they're going through this is the shows that we're talking about and the stories that we're telling are not kind of a subset of musical theater, but in fact, it is the history of musical theater. That musical theater, in fact, has been a Black form of, it has used music created by Black writers from its origins.
Yeah, and that's something that I've been teaching in my class we talked about earlier, which is, all of the African-American genres, musical genres that were created ended up in musical theater.
Right, yeah.
And so a lot of the evolution of musical theater is due to the art forms that were created.
That's right.
Yeah. In African-American communities. So if we want to find out information about these exhibitions, where do we go? If
you go to nypl.org, for New York Public Library, so nypl.org/LPA, you'll be able to find anything you want.
Thank you for joining us here before the curtain rises, the Designer series. Thank you to Doug Reside. And for more information about all the videos we have coming up, Make sure you sign on to our YouTube channel, and there's a little notification button. Click that button so you'll be the first one to get all the new information that's coming out, all the new videos, you'll get them first. So please click that notification button. And for any other information about what we're doing at Black Theater United, you can always sign on to www.blacktheaterunited.com.